Good evening and welcome to night 2 of the I Heart Pluto Festival, where we're celebrating the cultural and scientific importance of Pluto. My name is Kevin Schindler and I'm the historian here at Lowell Observatory, and I'll be with you throughout the week. We've got a lot of great programs. Last night we heard from Alan Stern, the principal investigator of New Horizons mission, and we have astronauts, artists, astronomers, all sorts of folks that'll be speaking with us this week. The festival goes on for 6 nights. This year it's all virtual. So anybody with an internet connection, you can get on and it's all free. So we not only have these programs each night, but we also have some ongoing things. Our friends down at Karma Sushi Bar Grill has brought back the popular Pluto roll this year, which is a really great cultural tie to Pluto. Our friends from the local amateur radio group, they're set up out in our parking lot right now, I think, broadcasting this week about Pluto and doing some events related to that. And then we also have an art show. The International Association of Astronomical Artists, I just have to think about that. They've got an art show that you can see from the iHeart Pluto website. So that stuff is all ongoing this week. And we also have our gift shop has special Pluto items. And so we encourage you to take part in that. This is one of the things we have. This is a magnet. And this is also on a poster we made. This is a design by Tyler Nordgren, who's done a lot of really great astro designs for national parks and us and a lot of other folks. So a lot of great Pluto stuff that's happening. Another book I should point out, or another thing in the gift shop, is this book, Discovering Pluto. And this is authored by Dale Cruikshank and one of our presenters tonight, Bill Sheehan. Dr. Bill Sheehan is a retired psychiatrist, but he's also a lifelong astronomy historian. We also have Dave Eicher, who's the editor-in-chief of Astronomy magazine, the largest astronomy magazine of its kind in the world. And Dave is also on the advisory board here at Lowell Observatory. And we also have Al Tombaugh. Al is Clyde Tombaugh's son. Excuse me. Now lives in. I'm all choked up about that, Al. He lives in Las Cruces, New Mexico, and so this is going to be a really great conversation, I think, tonight. This is an open conversation, so we'll be talking amongst us. I might be choking a little bit here, but we'll be talking, and also if you have questions, just type those into the YouTube feed. And we'll get to those as we can. So it's really a pretty open format. So I'm coming from you from, it looks kind of boring in the background, but I'm sitting in what was Clyde Tombaugh's office. It's now the office of Amanda Bosch, who, among other things here at the observatory, she's an astronomer and is also in charge of a lot of our technical facilities. But Amanda was on the team that discovered the atmosphere of Pluto in 1988. So it's kind of neat to have this Pluto aura. Bill is coming from Clyde Tombaugh's apartment right above me. Al is speaking to us from Las Cruces, which is where Clyde lived the last decades of his life. And Dave is coming from the world headquarters, as I think of it, as Astronomy magazine. You might correct me on that, maybe within a few miles. Welcome, everybody. To this program tonight. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. So let me just get these things started a little bit. To maybe I'll pose this question to you, and then everybody else can answer. What's your connection to Clyde Tombaugh?
Well, my connection started in 1945 when I was born, because Clyde Tombaugh was my dad. So there was a pretty close connection.
Dave?
And I had the great privilege of getting to know Clyde near the end of his life in the 1980s and the early 1990s, spent some time with him in part because I had this magazine, Deep Sky, and a bunch of people wrote for it and also went to Astronomy magazine. David Levy was one of our contributors who wrote Clyde's biography. Brian Skiff, one of our pals at Lowell there. And we spent time with Clyde. He was very nice and embraced these young, crazy guys who were interested in Pluto. And so have great fond memories of his generosity and also his amazing, of course, sense of humor, which I'm sure we'll talk about.
Yeah, we'll get to that for sure. Bill, what's your initial connection with Clyde?
Well, my initial connection, as for many people of my era, was this book, which was kind of a children's book, but it basically told the story of the search for Planet X, and in particular, Clyde's role in discovering Pluto. And so at that point, when I was about 10 years old, he became a real hero of mine. Many years later, when I was starting to get really interested in how observers saw what they saw on the planets, I wrote to Clyde, and I didn't hear anything for months. And then finally, in the mailbox, there plopped this letter that was about 5 pages long, in which Clyde had broken off the initial attempt to write something around Christmas time until the following March. And he apologized. He says, "Oh my goodness, a lot of time has passed. I've been swamped." And he continued the letter, and it was just an amazing dissertation of all of the factors that went into how the human eye, brain, hand system worked in terms of recording detail on the planets. And I was just flabbergasted that this great man was willing to take out that much time and so meticulously answer the questions of a person that he had never heard of before.
Those are quite some artifacts you have there, Bill. And a lot of people have those because, that's how Clyde was, right? Well, let's talk about this guy. I mean, he's known today as the man who discovered Pluto in 1930. I'm sitting about 8 feet from where I'm sitting, actually, in the Blink comparator room right next to where I am. He was an astronomer, most remembered for that, but there are a lot of different sides to him. Maybe, Al, you can start out talking about, just briefly, Al's upbringing, or Clyde's upbringing, and how he got interested in astronomy.
Sure. Dad was born on a farm in Streator, Illinois, near Streator, Illinois, and in 1906. And he was always interested in a lot of different things. The family later moved to a farm near Burdett, Kansas, a wheat farm near Burdett. And his uncle Lee was always kind of an amateur astronomer and very interested in the planets and so forth. And he let Dad look through a small telescope he had. This was when he was 14 years old. That stimulated Dad's interest considerably, and he wanted to learn a lot more about where we live and what might be living on other bodies within our solar system. So that stimulated his real quest for knowledge about the planets.
Okay. And so, Dave, maybe you can take it from there of, the story of how Clyde ended up at Lowell Observatory.
Well, and I think it was a book about Mars that his parents brought home to him when he was in high school, really ignited his imagination. Like a lot of very clever people who were mechanically talented, he immediately got very interested in this and built telescopes, and he built them well. And long story short, he got very interested in observing planets and drawing them. He made meticulous sketches of them and had this sort of incredible enthusiasm, I believe, bubbling out of his exploration of the universe. He had a nice dark sky there when it was clear. And so he sent these drawings to Lowell and a few other places. And it was V.M. Slifer. This was, of course, after Percival Lowell was gone. But V.M. Slifer, the right-hand man, if you will, of Percival Lowell, was the director and saw these things. And this magical timing coincided with Lowell Observatory needing a young, enthusiastic, and relatively affordable guy who could step in and get into this program of one of Percival Lowell's unfulfilled dreams, the search for Planet X. So there's a great story, of course, about Clyde being offered a job and and then taking this train out into the West, into this great unknown, to work for a man who was a somewhat mysterious, austere guy who we'd never met. And then this great adventure unfolded fairly rapidly with the planet search, of course.
And Bill, maybe you can comment on what the observatory was like at the time and why they were looking for this planet.
Right. Well, the 1920s was a pretty difficult time for Lowell Observatory because it was famously broke. When Percival Lowell died in 1916, his widow, Constance, immediately started a lawsuit to try to break Lowell's will, which had bequeathed his estate to the perpetuation of the observatory and its work. And this dragged on for almost 10 years. A lot of the observatory's assets were drained down for attorney's fees, and eventually it was settled in 1925. And so during this period, V.M. Slifer, who was the person that Lowell basically chose to carry on his work as the director, faced a really difficult time where he had to delay paying the staff, borrow against future staff salaries in order to make ends meet. And I think as a result of that trauma, VM became somewhat tight-fisted with money, and actually devoted more and more of his later years to his own business interests, where he spent a lot of time in his office actually doing real estate deals, investments, and things like that. And a number of people that knew VM said that he was a rather remote, austere, as Dave said, businessman. And so I think the hiring of Clyde largely reflected that. VM said later that the observatory didn't want to hire an accomplished astronomer, someone that had education. They essentially wanted somebody that would be a self-starter, very motivated, able to work without a great deal of supervision, to take on what was really a pretty speculative assignment. And I don't want to belabor it too much, but basically when Percival Lowell died, one of his unfulfilled dreams, apart from the fact that he wasn't able to convince other astronomers that there was life on Mars, was that he thought that there might be a planet beyond Neptune that was causing some irregularities in the movements of that giant planet in Uranus. And he searched for it during his life, did all sorts of calculations. I mean, there's like 20 large folders full of calculations that he did to try to locate the position of this planet. And when he died, it was one of the great tragedies of his life that it hadn't been found. And so the observatory, once it finally got funded again, had Percival's brother donate funds to get a new telescope that would be more suitable for the task. And Clyde came unsuspectingly to take over this, what really was sort of a chimerical quest for this planet. And so that's what Clyde got into. And so that's kind of the history that led to Clyde's coming here.
So Dave, what happened after that?
Well, I think it was a great meeting of circumstance, because not only exactly as Bill said was that the situation and the circumstance for this planetary search, but Clyde was really the guy to do it too, because he was on a mission. He was obsessed with this. He was a detail-oriented guy. He, as we've talked about many times, he had to look at hundreds of thousands and millions of images of stars, blinking them on this large blink comparator, taking them on 14 by 17 inch glass plates with what we now lovingly call the Pluto camera or the Pluto telescope, the A. Lawrence Lowell telescope, this photographic telescope that is a great treasure of the astronomy world now, and taking comparison plates that could be looked at and blinked, so to speak, in a special machine that would blink between the two plates and enable you with incredible precision to study them as the machine clanked along and see things that moved in the star fields because the two exposures were taken at different times. So Clyde saw many, many, many moving objects, and eventually it became clear that to go after this hypothetical planet that was believed to be out there, it would be good to look at a particular part of the sky at a particular time that would make the movement of distant objects slight and therefore possibly easier to spot. And so as 1929 rolled through, that incredible year in American history, Clyde was on an unstoppable mission. He had a routine to set up this dome and this telescope and look at very high magnification to see on a bright star what the scene was like, and a process to get the whole telescope ready that reminds me of a commercial pilot getting an aircraft ready to fly. He was unbelievably detailed and meticulous, and over and over studied these fields until, of course, we know what happened in February 1930, finally, after the fall season of 1929, when he found the suspicious object where you are sitting, Kevin, and Carl Lampland was across the hall, and the story unravels from there.
So, and history was made. February 18th, 1930, the planet that we know as Pluto, he discovered. Maybe this is a good place to stop for a second. And Al, we have a question here. What did Clyde's parents think of his pursuits? And I would take that, first of all, what did they think of this, him coming out here and following his passion for astronomy? And then also, what did they think after the discovery? And maybe you can even mention how they found out, because it's a pretty good story.
Yes. My father's father was also interested in astronomy at a very amateur basis. And so he liked the idea of my father's interest. However, he did want my father to stay on the farm, on the wheat farm, because he was a very reliable worker, and that's what farming was all about. When Dad got very interested in the stars, he started building telescopes. And one of the first telescope he built was terrible. Second telescope he built for his Uncle Lee was a very good telescope, a 7-inch reflector. And then he built the 9-inch. The 9-inch telescope was what he used to draw the pictures of Jupiter and Mars that he sent to Lowell Observatory. He wasn't ready for the transition, let's say, to a professional life in astronomy. However, he didn't want to turn that down. His parents understood that he didn't want to stay on the farm and labor, and he wanted to expand his horizons. So they certainly didn't hold him back at all. They were a little leery about what he might face because he was inexperienced in social life, but they were encouraging for him to leave. So there wasn't any friction from that standpoint in him pursuing the adventure at Lowell Observatory. I'm not sure exactly what announcement you were looking for, Kevin, regards to the family learning what Dad had done, but they didn't learn it directly from my father. They learned it from the news media.
Right, as he recounted later, after he made the discovery, it was 4:00 in the afternoon on February 18th, looking through the eyepiece, microscope eyepiece of the blink comparator, which was a machine he was using to compare pictures taken a few days apart, and looking for something that moved, as Dave was explaining. And when he made the discovery, as Dave said, Carl Lampland came over, one of his colleagues here, to do some measurements. And then Clyde went down to the director's office and said, "I found your Planet X," to VM Slifer. They looked at his sum, and VM Slifer told your dad, "Don't tell anybody, because we want to study it more. Go outside tonight and photograph it. Now that we know where it's located, find it with the big telescope so we can see if it's, appears as a disk or if it has moons or whatever. But don't tell anybody, because we want to study it first." and he didn't tell anybody. And it's great to look at the letters in our collections here at Lowell and also at New Mexico State that have a very large collection of Clyde's papers. And he was writing letters to his family up until a couple of days that they announced it on March 13th. So they studied it for several weeks. And he never hinted at anything except for in one letter, I think he wrote it March 10th. So they were just about ready to announce it. After asking about the cow and how everybody was doing toward the end, he said, something to the effect, it's been busy here. And that was it. And so the parents didn't know. And so as the story goes, February 18th, the telephone rang on the farm and it was the local newspaper. What do you think of what your son did? And his dad said, what did Clyde do? He discovered a planet. That's how he found out, the newspaper calling him. So it's, I think it tells about who Clyde was in terms of, following orders, doing what was right, dedication. I think that says a lot about his personality. And we have another question. Let me cut in here, and then we'll just kind of have an open conversation after this. What did Clyde? We have another question. When funding is mentioned, is that government funding, private donors, or both? This is back in the day of Lowell Observatory, where it was all private funding. This was decades before any sort of grants from government agencies. So this was all private funding. And there wasn't much. It was really tight. And one more question here, Al, that is probably appropriate for you. This is from a person that asking, what was Clyde's brother's name? I worked with him in Salina, Kansas.
That was Robert Tombaugh. He was a professor of chemistry, I think, in Kansas. He was also a professor here at New Mexico State University for a short period of time and lived here in Las Cruces.
Mm-hmm. So, Al, maybe you can finish your dad's story after he made the discovery, just where he ended up living and what he did for the rest of his life. And then we'll just kind of talk about Clyde, some of his personality and that sort of thing.
Sure. During the war, Dad also was appointed as civil defense director, commander for Coconino County and Flagstaff, and so he carried that along with his other duties at Lowell Observatory. At the end of the war, my mom and Dad went to UCLA on a sabbatical assignment to teach there for 1 year. They both taught at UCLA. After that time, they came back to Lowell Observatory, and to my father's astonishment, actually, they found that his position had been eliminated. Dad actually thought he was going to spend the rest of his days at Lowell doing what he loved to do. He then acquired a professorship at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, but my mother's brother, James Edson, was working with JPL and the Department of the Army in putting together a research center at White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico with captured V2s from Peenemünde in Germany after the war. Uncle James, in working with Werner von Braun and several other people, had rather a bad experience with data that they were acquiring from the missile flights, and realized that they needed some other method to acquire better data about the flights of the missiles that they were testing. My uncle, James, thought that probably the best thing to do was to get better photographic work through telescopic observation, and knew that my dad could probably tackle that adventure. So he convinced my father to abandon the professorship at the University of New Mexico and come to White Sands Proving Ground in 1946. So Dad did that. He created the observation system for rockets at White Sands Proving Ground. He worked there until 1955, And shortly before 1955, they had started the nearer satellite search that was mentioned before. There was a lot of red involved in White Sands government operations, and my dad was not somebody that relished that type of endeavor. So he demanded that they move the satellite search, his part of it, to Physical Science Laboratory at New Mexico, what is now New Mexico State University. So he was there from 1955 on until he retired. He was also a professor at New Mexico State University in astronomy and geology. He started the astronomy department and started the doctoral program in astronomy at New Mexico State University, and established several observatories on campus and on other sites around southern New Mexico. After he retired, he still was professor emeritus and did a lot of guest lectures at New Mexico State University, and then pursued his own studies of the planets and other solar systems that he could use from his home telescopes, which were pretty elaborate. So that was pretty much his life after the discovery of Pluto.
Okay. So let's, he had quite an accomplished career, but if we go back to 1930, he discovers this planet, and I'll just kind of open this up to everybody. Why hadn't Pluto been found before then? And was this really that remarkable of a find, or did he get lucky, or what was the story with that?
Kevin, can I add a little bit of texture to the sort of schematic account that Dave gave earlier? And I think it brings out some highlights in Clyde's personality. When Clyde came in 1929, there was a lot of question about the reliability of Percival Lowell's calculations. And in fact, it later was shown after Pluto was discovered that it was too small and insignificant a mass to have accounted for any of the so-called perturbations that Lowell thought that he was seeing in the movement of Uranus and Neptune. In fact, those were a mirage, a little bit like the canals of Mars. So it's easy to kind of think of, in retrospect, as history always looks in retrospect, like this march to glory, that Clyde came here, he was given a clear assignment, and he moved, through diligence towards this discovery. But in fact, the story has a lot more rough edges and rocky paths to it. When Clyde first came here, the telescope wasn't ready yet. And so Clyde spent the first few months actually doing things like snow shoveling, janitorial work. And when it finally was ready, VM Slifer gave Clyde only 3 days of supervision, 3 nights of supervision on the telescope before he more or less turned him loose on his own. And there were a lot of facets to taking pictures on these large plates. They were about 11 by 17 inches, so they were huge. And in order to get the images to be sharp across the whole field, the plates actually had to be curved somewhat around the edges. And this required precision use of some screws to basically bend the plates. And in cold weather, the plates could be very fragile, and in fact, they easily shattered. When a person was attempting to get them the right curvature. And again, this is very precision work, because if you don't get the curvature just right, the images are going to be blurry and essentially useless. As you take a series of plates, they all have to be registered with each other in terms of the focus, the position of the stars on that. And so Clyde was doing this kind of thing. DM Slifer assigned him to take images in Gemini. And the reason for that is Lowell's last of several calculations suggested that planet X was in Gemini. Now, Gemini was in a poor position for imaging at that time. It was low near the horizon. The skies in that area were not very transparent. But in fact, Pluto was there, as was later found. Clyde shattered the first plate he exposed on Gemini, and he later said, I should have known that's where Pluto was because my first plate shattered when I looked there. So Clyde was assigned to doing these plates. Now you have to remember this is 1930. You're exposing plates during winter conditions at 7,000 feet. And anybody that's lived in Flagstaff knows that the nights get very cold. And you're sitting in there, as Dave was saying, you're looking through a high-powered eyepiece at a guide star. And you have to sit there for about 2 hours centering on that star. There weren't headphones, there weren't radio broadcasts, anything like that to distract you. So this is extremely tedious work. And so, but Clyde took it on. And after he was doing this for about 3 months, and the senior astronomers were blinking these plates, which is another tedious job, VM Slifer came into Clyde's office and said, Clyde, you've been taking these images. Now I want you to start blinking them as well. And Clyde was poleaxed because that essentially doubled his work. He's registering millions of images on these plates. And now not only did he have to stay up at night taking these pictures, but he also had to blink them looking for this planet. And so that essentially made him responsible for 2 jobs rather than just one. And when this happened, Clyde at first couldn't believe it because he assumed that the senior astronomers would want to be responsible for making sure that if there was a planet on these plates, they found it. And for them to assign this to him really surprised him. But later he kind of thought that VM and C.O. Lamplin had sort of given up by then. They'd gone through a number of these searches when Percival Lowell was alive. And he sort of felt that they probably had sort of thrown in the towel. Well, there were a few other obstacles that Clyde faced. One of them, and I won't say a lot about it, but a lot of asteroids were showing up on these plates. And some of them are very faint. And asteroids, since they mostly lie outside of the orbit of the Earth, like Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, they go through a retrograde motion, which is really a reflection of the Earth's motion around the sun. And so when they're near opposition, in other words, opposite the sun, they're moving fast, but then they slow down and they can mimic an outer planet, say one at the distance of Neptune or beyond Neptune. And so Clyde went home in July of 1929. He was on the verge of basically throwing in the towel, although he didn't really know what else he would do with just a high school degree and wanting a career in science. But when he was there, he studied some books, and he found out that if you take the images only near where the opposition point is relative to the sun, you're going to catch these asteroids when they're moving the fastest. And essentially that it's like a race course, and you can tell how far away these things are. And when he realized that, he realized he cut his work significantly because he wouldn't have to double check all of these asteroids. And he came back, he was highly motivated at that point. He was moving in his imaging through some of the beautiful areas like Pisces, where there were all these galaxies, and he started marveling at their sheer beauty. And so at that point, he was pretty much operating on his own. He'd figured everything else out. He wasn't worried very much about where Percival Lowell had his calculations had put the planet, because he'd sort of decided that those calculations were unreliable. And in the end result, the discovery of Pluto owed everything to the sheer tenacity and meticulousness of Clyde's search, and very little to the calculations. And just as a sidebar to that, when the discovery of Pluto was announced, it was announced as if it were the fulfillment of Percival Lowell's dream. He had dreamed this icy world on the frigid edge of the solar system, and it had been found. And Clyde wasn't even mentioned in the discovery telegram. So I think he didn't say a lot about that, but I think that did hurt him a little bit, as later, as Alden was saying, did the fact that Lowell Observatory, despite his making this great discovery, didn't keep him on, after the war years. So,
Al, so what did your dad think about all that? Did he talk about that much later on?
About the fact that he wasn't originally recognized? Or
Right.
that question?
How did he feel about how he was treated, after the discovery? And then we know, of course, about years later, the job wasn't there anymore. But just how did he feel like he was getting the credit? Did you ever talk about that?
Dad wasn't a credit junkie, so that probably didn't bother him too much. However, he was cognizant that there was some friction about giving him credit where he thought credit was due. And so there was some consternation, both with him and my mother, who came on the scene later and was at Lowell, of course, after the discovery with my dad. The particulars of it, I don't think we need to go into here. That the fact that there was some friction, and as was mentioned, that's probably what led to his position being eliminated for what was termed at the time budgetary concerns. And my dad was shocked about that. He was very disappointed, and it was difficult for him to comprehend why that was done. However, because of his tenacity in doing whatever, he looked forward to the professorship in Albuquerque, and then very much after the initiation of a bit of fright at Sands Proving Ground about setting up an optical instrumentation system at White Sands.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, we have about 10 minutes left, so let's talk a little bit more about some of the personality of Clyde Tombaugh. Something that at least one of you mentioned were his jokes, his sense of humor. Let's talk about that a little bit, because that certainly was a big part of who he was.
It was an extraordinary thing, I thought. And for this guy who, for young people in the 80s who were into astronomy and publishing things and so on, obviously Clyde was a great hero, but he was so kind and so funny all the time in hanging out with you. And we know about the puns, and the puns came out of Clyde, it was very well known, one every minute or two. I mean, and you just have to go, oh, Clyde, it was just kind of groaning, and he would go, ha, so on. But we know the comments had been made about the naming of Pluto, and, Venetia Burney, the 11-year-old English school child who suggested the name Pluto, and maybe some thought about Pluto at Lowell as well independently. And of course, the first two letters of the name, coinciding with Percival Lowell's initials, all that was good. But later people ask him, well, did the Disney character, did that have anything to do with it? Which actually was sort of caught fire a little afterward. But and Clyde would say, well, if it did have something to do with it, that would have been a doggone shame, and he talked about, a colleague rebuilding his house and having to redo the brickwork on the exterior, and how that made him mortified. And it was just these came out of him so naturally. It was extraordinary. And I just very quickly will tell a story. In the 1980s, I was at the Texas Star Party. Clyde was speaking their big amateur event, and David Levy was there, and Brian Skiff with us, and we were speaking as well. And I had a sketchbook. I was drawing galaxies in the era when large Dobsonian scopes were first sort of there, and looking at and I couldn't find my sketchbook anywhere. And we were all sitting, laughing, talking with Clyde about this, that, and everything. All of a sudden, Clyde finally said, oh, your I think I'm sitting on your sketchbook, and got up on a folding chair, of course, and he handed it. And so he insisted, this is Clyde's sense of humor. He wrote, I sat on this book, Clyde W. Tombaugh. David Levy, of course, had to write, it was my chair, and I finished it and signed it with, it's my book. So that it struck me, there was always a sense of fun and silliness around Clyde in the 80s and 90s. And that happened observing with his 16-inch in Las Cruces, as well as being at a meeting or something with him. It was just an infectious joy of discovering things about the universe and sharing things as humans with each other.
Let me ask,
Did you see that when you were growing up, or did that come later on? Or
No, Dad was always interested in playing with words. That was just one of his fetishes. He enjoyed a lot doing that. And so we enjoyed that along with him, although at some point in time, we thought, well, that maybe has gone a little too far, but that's kid stuff. But he enjoyed that, and the family did too. Throughout his life, it was his punnery and his play on words was perhaps a little bit of cover for his embarrassment about his fame. He did not relish the fame game, if you want to call it that. He felt a little uncomfortable about that. So it may have been one of his ways to avoid some of the feelings about being famous.
and he years later he was on the TV show. I can't remember the name of it, a quiz show, and he won a carton of cigarettes and something else because nobody guessed who he was.
Yeah, that was I've Got a Secret out of New York. Yeah, he actually smoked for a while too. Of course, the majority of us now have stopped that trend, and he did too. He smoked a pipe for a while, and he smoked cigarettes for a while. Enjoyed the adventures that he had, because there were several other TV programs he was on, We the People and some other programs like that also. But he was always reluctant to be the famous person.
Mm-hmm. So we have a few minutes left here. How do each of you remember Clyde Tombaugh? If you were to describe him to somebody who had never heard of Clyde Tombaugh before, didn't know this is the guy who discovered Pluto, how would you describe him to somebody like that?
I think
Go ahead.
one thing based on what Alden just said, I think he had this very disarming manner, put people at ease, but the puns, the kind of hayseed background that he had concealed a very complex person. I think Clyde really deserves a full-fledged scholarly biography, because there was a lot more to him than met the eye. And I know, just briefly, the fame that he had about Pluto in part bothered him because it distracted people from some of the other work that he did that he thought was, in some ways more significant than the discovery of Pluto, which was in part just being at the right place at the right time. And so I would say that he was, a wonderfully charming, humane, approachable person, but beneath that was a great intellect and a very complex personality.
And Bill, you mentioned something about planets. Maybe it's worth mentioning what his favorite planet was, because he's, of course, remembered for Pluto, but that's not the whole story, right?
Well, I don't know if this is his favorite planet. He told me that Mars was his favorite planet. And that goes right back to what David was saying earlier, that he was fascinated by Mars, as many people were during that period. And he considered himself a serious student of Mars and wanted to be recognized for that. And in addition to the work that he did at White Sands, which he took a great deal of pride in and was very important, he also was, in a sense, the founding father of modern planetary photography. And he was the mentor to Brad Smith, who became the imaging leader of the Voyager, probably the most epic spacecraft mission of our time. And Brad, got to know very well, told me that he hadn't really been interested in the planets until he came into contact with Clyde. And Clyde's infectious enthusiasm and willingness to mentor him turned him into a leading figure of the next generation. So, you know, I think all of this work that Clyde did is almost unheralded, and yet it really deserves to have its day in the sun.
And I totally agree, Bill. And he, of course, we didn't really talk much about this, but he did so much work in other areas too. He did work on galaxy clusters, the Perseus galaxy cluster. He did a lot of work on other small bodies in the solar system with discovery, with a nova, with a comet, with variable stars. He did a lot of work in a lot of areas aside from planetary science as well that doesn't get talked about a lot. And I think, just to add quickly, you know, I got to know Clyde first when he was, I guess, approaching 80. You know, he was aging, he was slight, he was hunched, you know, he was funny, you know, immediately. But I think of the thing that really strikes me, he was very genuine. He was interested in what you were doing. He wanted to talk with you. Well, what do you think about this? And let's talk about M33 and its black hole, or what's going on in your life and with your parents. He was very interested and very genuine in everything that was going on with people he talked about. And you can't fake that. You know, that was very deep and genuine, I think, in him.
One of the things that Dad probably, to the family, was most noted for was his sincere honesty, both him and my mother. I never, ever remember my dad a lie, even a little white lie. We could always rely on what he said to be factual, and my mother's comments also to be factual. And that was kind of the legacy for the family. He was always someone to look up to. He was an example set for hard work and a respect for all living things. And also, I might mention that really, I think his favorite planet was Earth. He was a geographer, I can't think of the word right now, a geologist. He also taught geology. He loved geology. One of the things that he did was, when we went on vacation and we were traveling in the car, he'd point out every rock formation and how it was created and approximately it was created. And he had an intense infatuation with the planet Earth.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we're just about out of time. We had a question from somebody asking, it kind of ties in with Clyde's sense of humor, and it's this picture of Clyde blinking himself. And I'm going to bring this up. I just got this in a PowerPoint. Let me see if I can, I'll get this set. We'll end with that. But one last question I think is good, that gets to the core of who Clyde was. Maybe, Al, this is good for you. What was Patsy's role, his wife's role in his career?
Mom was the glue of our family. She held everything together. Dad was always thinking about astronomy and that side of life. He was an excellent father, although he didn't do a lot of the typical fatherly things with sons and daughters that you might think. But my mom all held that together. She kept everything grounded in the family. She was a very intense person in her own right. She had a degree in philosophy. She was an artist, she was a teacher. But Mom, really the person that allowed my father to get his mind off into space and then bring him back to a sense of reality.
Well, that's great. Well, I think we're ready to end here. I'm going to leave with this slide that I hope everybody can see. Is that showing up?
Yes.
And this is Clyde's sense of humor. It's him blinking himself. If you look up on the internet, you can see a video of this. The arrow is pointing to the astronomer, I think is how it's described. So just a great sense of humor, a great person, a great American, a great scientist. It's really a pleasure to be able to talk to him and really a pleasure to have you, Al, and Dave, and Bill here tonight to talk about him a little bit and his legacy. So thanks everybody for joining us, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you.